Welcome once again to 4SA's YouTube channel. Today we're going to be having a very important discussion following the national elections and the formation of the Government of National Unity. And specifically, we're going to be talking about how the lawmaking process works and what we can expect in the coming days. Obviously, we all had our say during the national elections, and we have seen perhaps the power that we have as citizens to influence the government and the outcomes that we are now going to be living with for the next 5 years. But very importantly, what can we do and how can we understand our role as citizens in the coming days to make sure that our voice isn't just heard once every now and again when these general elections are called, but in every situation, in every context where laws are being made, because that's our constitutional right. And to give us more insight on this, I'm delighted to say that we have with us on this call Lisa Pretorius, who is 4SA's head of legal, and Nobukosi Zulu, who is our legal research genius and guru. So without more ado, let's get into this. And let me just start, Lisa, putting the first question to you. The president announced the composition of cabinet. Maybe let's just start off with getting an understanding of what is the role of the president and the cabinet in the context of government.
Thank you, Michael. So the president and the cabinet are the leadership team of the executive branch of our government. The president, who is represented by the office of the president and is currently President Cyril Ramaphosa, has extensive executive powers in his own right. And this includes the power to have the final say on signing legislation into law once it has been approved by both houses of parliament. And for example, we saw President Ramaphosa exercising this power immediately before the elections when he signed the controversial hate speech bill, which is now the Controversial Hate Speech Act, just before the elections. The Office of the Presidency has also observed the running of all state-owned enterprises. So there's a significant amount of economic power now vested and concentrated in the presidency. We have a combined total of 77 cabinet ministers and deputy ministers. So that's quite a lot. And they are appointed by the president in consultation with the political parties who make up the Government of National Unity. And of course, these ministers and their deputy ministers lead specific areas of governments called departments. And whoever leads a department or is a high-ranked official in the department has significant power to determine and implement policies affecting that sector that department is responsible for. The executive branch of government also has limited legislative, in other words, lawmaking powers. Ministers can sign off, for example, on regulations, which is a form of delegated legislation under an existing act of parliament. And then the president also has some limited lawmaking powers of his own. For example, the president can issue a proclamation.
So obviously what 4SA is often engaged with, or the main, let's say, government structures that we deal with at a cabinet level are the different departments. And as you said, we have now a number, I think we have 32 different ministries, but obviously we're not involved with all of them. So Nobu, maybe you can give us an outline of what the main, or who the main departments are who we engage with, and typically maybe just remind us of some of the instances where we have in the past engaged with these different government departments.
Sure, thank you, Michael. As we know that religion is not something that is private. It can be expressed publicly. So there's always going to be a number of government departments that we're engaged with. But throughout the years, there's been some key ones. And the first one is COGTA, which is the Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Department. And that's the department that's responsible for the CRL Rights Commission. And that is the one that's the minister that was also the minister who governed the nation during the national state of disaster during the COVID pandemic. And we remember what that was like for religious freedoms. Another department that we work with very closely is the Department of Basic Education. And this is a department that we've had clashes with concerning the ECE toolkit that we found out about last year, and we're still working against. And, we are concerned that there's been an ideological capture of this department through the establishment of the Social Inclusion and Equity in Education Directorate. And for example, this unit has taken a lot of foreign funding and we also see that this DBE continues to push strongly this radical comprehensive sexuality education, the CSE, which globally has been spoken against, and it's been pushed into South African schools after receiving, again, a lot of money from US aid, which is obviously very questionable. And there's also the Justice and Constitutional Department, and this department was responsible for drafting the hate speech bill, as Liesl corrected, the Hate Speech Act, and the Promotion and PEPUDA, the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, that amendment bill. And both of those have been serious threats to religious freedom.
Yes, and of course, another one that we have also been engaging with closely and I think successfully is the Department of Home Affairs. Now, the Department of Home Affairs initially produced a white paper on marriages in South Africa, where we were involved for a 3-year process. And they have now obviously produced on the back of that, as its foundation, the new marriage bill. And we have been contending and have, I think, successfully contended hard for the inclusion of a clause to specifically protect the conscientious objection rights of religious marriage officers. So if you are a religious marriage officer listening to this, the good news is that in its current drafting, and this is what you need to obviously affirm and support going forward, you can no longer, or you cannot at all be forced to solemnize any marriage that conflicts with your beliefs or those of the religious organization that you represent. And we're certainly grateful that this marriage bill now contains this express provision. So we also have other entities or departments that we have been involved with. The form of publications was one such issue. But let's just move on. Liesl, what is the role of these different government departments? What do they do, and how can we engage with them at different moments?
Well, Michael, each government department is staffed by civil servants, and their job is to implement the policies and direction determined by the minister and the deputy minister, who are in turn guided, of course, by and accountable to the president and the broader cabinet. So that is part of their very important functions. And typically a government department also develops new legislation based on government policies. For example, there's a gap or there's an issue that needs to be addressed. Government departments develop policy positions through a process of consultation. So a draft policy document is called a green paper, and then the final official policy document is called a white paper, and a white paper determines the policy position for legislation that is drafted and is applicable to that sector. Government departments take the initiative. They initiate new or new legislation. They can even update existing legislation to give effect to policy positions, policy objectives, etc. And often, ideally, they consult broadly with stakeholders and interested persons in developing these laws and policies. The initial draft of a new law, while it's still within the department, is called a draft bill. So that's when it's still with the department before it's introduced to Parliament. Of course, once it's introduced to Parliament, it's called a bill. So government departments, they have a lot of input in these bills. They guide the drafting of these bills through the lawmaking process up until the point that it is approved by cabinet and tabled in Parliament. Once the draft bill then is tabled and becomes a bill of Parliament, Parliament takes ownership of the bill. But of course, departments continue to provide input. They are invited to brief parliamentary committees to ask questions by the MPs on that committee. Where legislation has already been passed by Parliament, relevant departments are authorized often to make further regulations. These regulations guide, for example, the implementation of acts of Parliament under which there are issues. This is the finer details and the daily nuts and bolts kind of thing. The rules and requirements of public participation, the public participation process in respect of policy documents and regulations and other documents that are issued under or created by government departments is not as clear-cut as the parliamentary public participation process. So this can, and in some instances, does harm the quality. And when I say quality, I refer to meaningfulness of the public participation process at the government department level.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned, of course, that departments, once a law is in play or has been passed, they can or they are authorized to develop further regulations. That's like sub-legislation in a sense. And we've seen how problematic that can be. I think everybody will remember lockdown under the National Disaster Act, where significant powers were given to COGTA. And essentially, this enabled them to rule the country for over 2 years simply by passing regulations. And of course, those regulations did not require any further input or oversight from Parliament. That was a major problem because that essentially removed that vital element of accountability that is crucial for democratic systems. And again, significantly, you might remember that as the state of disaster finally ended and COGTA had to give up or hand over or release its unilateral powers, it actually tried to secure the government even greater powers through the Department of Health. And how did they do this? Well, they tried to make significant amendments to the existing health regulations. They tried to use regulations to effectively give the Minister of Health incredible unilateral and unaccountable powers to declare effectively a health emergency for a vast range of different reasons, or potentially for no really good reason at all. Now, in this instance, and this is where the public participation becomes so critical, over 325,000 citizens objected to those draft health regulations. And as a consequence of that, these amendments actually were never finalized and have never come into operation. So that gives you a very good example of exactly how the power of public participation can work when we get involved, when we stand up, when we engage with the rights that we've been given. So Nobu, tell us now, what role does then Parliament play in the lawmaking process?
Well, Parliament plays the biggest role in the lawmaking process because Parliament is the legislative branch of government. And as you can imagine, it's impossible for all 400 of South Africa's members of Parliament in the National Assembly and the 90 members in the National Council of Provinces to all be involved in considering every law. It's just too much. And for this reason, both the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces, they consist of various committees which correspond to one or more of the different government departments. There are other special purpose committees as well. Generally, the committees in the National Assembly are called portfolio committees, and the ones in the National Council of Provinces are called select committees. And these committees consist of members of the parliamentary houses, and they roughly are in proportion to the general political party representation. And since the dawn of our democracy, ANC has generally had the majority of seats in the committees. However, members of other political parties who often have levels of expertise and experience in different government areas, they've been able to challenge and debate proposed laws with more or less success. And I think in this new GNU, we're going to see our portfolio committees play a very significant, a much more significant role in the lawmaking process because the ANC no longer has an outright majority. So from a democratic perspective, that opens up greater debate, we hope, and more consideration of the members of the public, because members of the public are allowed to attend most of these parliamentary proceedings, the committee meetings, the plenary sessions, and to follow the legislative process. And the committees, they're supposed to give serious consideration to all the input received when they're deliberating a bill. If Parliament fails to ensure public participation is meaningful and a bill is passed or signed into law, that bill may be open to constitutional challenges in court because, as we've stated, public participation is a key aspect of any democracy. And the bills that exist, they must be considered by both houses of Parliament. And depending on the type of bill it is, there's slightly different processes that are followed, whether it's at the National Assembly or the National Council of Provinces. And when a bill is finally passed, it's sent to the president for his signature. The fancy word is for him to assent it. And once he signs this, it becomes an act of parliament. It becomes the official law of the land. And Parliament recently has just decided members who will serve on its various committees. And most of these committees are the ones who do the work of lawmaking. And this is where the lawmaking process takes place.
Yeah, and that is very much where we 4SA engage. So we now have our work cut out, as Nobu said. We now have the members appointed to the various parliamentary portfolio committees. It's I think it's 4 ANC I think it's 3DA, 2MK, I think it's 1 EFF, and then 1 from 2 of the other parties. There's 11 members now in each of these committees. So that's obviously a very important area where 4SA functions, and where you, in turn, as a member of the public, when they call for public participation, you will then be writing effectively to the secretary or whoever's appointed to receive the correspondence on behalf of the committee. And that is then considered within the committee. So it's a very, very significant opportunity and your constitutional right, because they must facilitate, these committees, meaningful public participation. And when a bill is opened for this consideration, then you have this opportunity to make your voice heard. And what we say is, the more people who participate, the louder the voice becomes. You know, one voice is a whisper, but 100,000 or 200,000, that becomes a shout. And of course, ultimately in politics, it is a numbers game. So we really want to encourage you in the coming days to take advantage and to follow 4SA, so that when we do tell you an issue and we give you the opportunity and the potential to make your voice heard, please do so, because it is a critical component of how we can continue to have our democratic say in the lawmaking process. And Lisa, maybe you could expound that out a little bit more. You know, what can we as citizens do, therefore, to play this ongoing role in the lawmaking process of the nation?
Well, yes, Michael. Many, even most people, believe that our democracy begins and ends with elections, but that absolutely is not so. And once every 4 years, and this year was one of those years, we see the posters on every lamppost shouting the political party slogans, promising us a better future. If only we would draw our X on the ballot paper next to the smiling politician of that particular political party. But how quickly promises are broken and forgotten, and it leaves people with a sense of frustration and powerlessness. But we are not powerless. Indeed, there are other things that we can do. So the good news is that the South African Constitution not only envisages a very different democratic experience, it guarantees that democratic experience. It demands transparency from government bodies. It requires them to conduct their business openly and transparently, so that we know what's going on, so that they can be held accountable. And whenever Parliament, whether it's the first House of the National Assembly or the second House of the National Council of Provinces, is considering passing a new law, it's considering a bill that's before it, it is required to ensure that there is meaningful public participation at every stage. So the emphasis is on meaningful, to a certain quality of public participation. And in principle, as we said earlier, that the same goes for our government departments, but the process and the specific requirements are less clear when it comes to government departments, especially when you have documents that are not legally enforceable. Public participation is a vital check and balance in the lawmaking process. It far exceeds the right to cast your vote in the general or provincial elections every couple of years. And importantly, this requirement of meaningful public participation is not fulfilled if the government fails to seriously consider the input it receives from the South African people. So when the government calls for public comments on a proposed policy or law, every single submission, in other words, every voice, must be given proper and due consideration. Now, we understand it's not a referendum, it's not a voting system, but every single voice needs to be given due consideration. But, you know, don't take my word for it, take the Constitutional Court's word for it. The Constitutional Court has said very clearly that public involvement cannot be meaningful in the absence of a willingness to consider all views expressed by the public. So there needs to be a willingness to consider all views. And that speaks to this serious engagement and attaching proper weight to all views. And even better news is that the Constitutional Court has also confirmed that if the government fails to follow this process, fails to facilitate meaningful public participation, and the law is subsequently passed, that law is open to a challenge in court. And then that law can potentially be struck down.
So Nobu, tell us, what is our role? How do we play in this process as 4SA? What do we do? How can we let people know how they can effectively follow us and benefit from what we do?
Thanks, Michael. So Freedom of Religion South Africa, and that's who we are, 4SA, we play a vital role in this democratic making process. As a non-profit and legal advocacy organization, our mandate is to protect and promote the right to religious freedom, which is guaranteed in our Constitution in Section 15. And one of our main contributions is that we examine every draft law, policy, regulation, or any other government document. I am yet to find anyone who has the ability to pay attention to detail like Liesl does. She looks at the laws and she ensures that she's able to suss out, and through that process, we then analyze the level of threat to religious freedoms, and we consider the legal arguments that are necessary to counter these threats. We summarize the issues of concern so that they can be easily and clearly understood, because sometimes the stuff is so complicated and it's not always easy to find. And through our legal analysis, we then inform the public, in particular the religious communities, of our views so that they can in turn be empowered to engage the broader community meaningfully and ensure that there's public participation in the lawmaking process. And we also monitor whether or not the government actually properly considers the views and concerns raised by the faith communities in South Africa. Like Michael pointed out, the beautiful example with the marriage bill, and what we saw there was public participation happened. 4SA followed up and was able to keep the public informed of what was happening, and the results have been quite positive. And so 4SA's role is critical, because without the level of knowledge and information we provide, most people would have little or no idea which laws are being proposed, let alone how they may affect them or what they can do about it. Because when you read an act, even sometimes as lawyers, we get very confused and the language is very dense, and you often need somebody to translate that to be understandable, which is what 4SA does. And our goal is to enable and encourage as many people as possible to exercise their right to push back or to support whenever there's a law that could potentially undermine their rights and freedoms, and to promote those that would protect our rights and freedoms. And so, Michael, why is supporting 4SA important? Now that you know what we do, why is it important to support us and follow us?
Yes. Well, when I was in the church world, I think one of the most, let's say, concerning things is that all of a sudden you find that some law has been passed and you didn't really know anything about it. And I think the very fact that 4SA is literally on the front lines in this fight for faith and freedom, we are, in a very real sense, the watchmen on the walls. We are, in a very real sense, the guardians, so to speak. And what we do is, once we have, as you said, identified and analyzed and presented, a critical success factor is as many people as possible then supporting our campaigns, making those submissions. As I said before, politics is a numbers game. And if enough people make their voices heard, then that is the most effective check and balance that we can have. The one reason, of course, why we are not living today under laws that will seriously undermine and erode our right to freedom is because we, 4SA, have been here. And you, or we collectively, the people, have already pushed back in large numbers. So it is vital that we learn from these successes. It is vital that we build upon them. It is obviously vital that we continue to do what we have done in the past. And we have now a new parliament. We have 5 years where we're now going to be having to keep watching out for these erosions to faith and freedom. And they're almost inevitably going to keep happening. We're never going to win more religious freedom than we currently have. And so, Liesl, maybe you could just end off by telling us how people can stay informed about threats that we may face to our right to faith and freedom.
So viewers who want to learn more about 4SA and the work that we do and stay informed of important developments can visit our website. The address is www.4sa.org.za. On our website, you can sign up for our newsletter so that you don't miss important developments and alerts. And you will also find our contact details on our website. And then we're also on social media. We have a Freedom of Religion SA Facebook page, and we have a YouTube channel that you've probably found. And there's a lot of other interesting videos on important topics that affect faith and freedom.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. And thank you to all those who've been watching this. I trust that you found this informative and helpful. And please remember, you really are so vital in the way that you support 4SA, and we need your support and your financial support as well, because we are only able to do what we do, and as well as we do it, because we have for the last 10 years been standing in this particular role and fighting for you. But we need you to value us. So please make donations, give us your financial support, even if it's a small amount, a once-off, or better still, a consistent ongoing contribution. Every cent that you give us is going towards the fight for faith and freedom. And you can go to our website, forsa.org.za, and click the Donate Now button. But in the meantime, we wish you well. And until the next time, thank you for watching and thank you for your support. This is Michael Swain of 4SA. Remember to like and share this video and then click on the subscribe button to make sure that you never miss our video updates on vital religious freedom issues.